And joining us for more is Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. She's a special envoy for Israel's foreign ministry, someone who frequently speaks out on behalf of Israel in these foreign media outlets, including the BBC. And Fleur, you heard there the chair of the BBC, again, refuting the claim of a bigger problem, certainly when it comes to its coverage of Israel on the BBC. I mean, even with these resignations, which were prompted, let's be honest, more by their reporting of President Trump than their reporting on Israel, if changes is really coming to the BBC.
Well, I don't think so, because they seem pretty unrepentant. Tim Davie and Deborah Turnes, who left, are saying, no, we don't have a bias problem. They don't have a bias problem. They retract 2 Gaza stories every week. The problem is that they put out the Gaza story, which is a blood libel on Israel. They get the facts wrong. They won't call Hamas terrorists. They take the numbers of the Hamas so-called health ministry and use it as fact, and they regurgitate the talking points of the terrorists. And they seem completely unrepentant. And with everything that's happened, with all the stories they've had to retract, let's talk about some example. Al-Ahli Hospital, where they said that Israel killed 500 people, it turned out to be a Hamas rocket, and then all of a sudden only 7 people were dead. The blood libels of starvation and famine, which now have been retracted by the UN, but who's looking at the retractions? And as you mentioned earlier, the famous documentary with the poor little boy in Gaza who turned out to be the son of the terrorist regime, Hamas's one of the ministers. They weren't even unrepentant about that. The only thing that has caused them to move is the fact that they did something to Trump. But I want to remind everybody that there's actually been a report, the Assassin report, that came out about a year ago that did a 9 million word check on the BBC and BBC Arabia, and they found it to be wholly biased. This is AI, and this is cold analysis that found them to be completely biased. What more proof do they need? Right.
And let's talk about the way this actually has impact in the real world, why we're talking it on Security Brief, because coverage of things like the Al-Ahli Hospital bombing actually started protests and riots throughout Europe, governments pressuring on Israel, arms boycotts, dealing with Israel, something you deal with as an envoy. So we're talking about not just changing just public opinion, but actually impacting on policy when it comes to Israel's security.
Absolutely. And even worse, they don't make the connection at all that the anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, and the UK especially, is connected to their negative coveraging, peddling blood libels about the only Jewish state in the world. Never mind the fact that there's real massacres and there's real genocide and there's real starvation going on in places like Sudan. Gets very little coverage. Right. So it's the obsession and the bias.
Right. So what needs to be done? I mean, you certainly have been active in this field, but what could the Israeli government be doing more, the Jewish community be doing more to deal with these kind of issues, especially when it comes to a platform as influential as the BBC?
Well, it would help if we actually had some type of strategy in this country for fighting the communications war. We don't. We don't have one central command of how to fight the communications war. You have the Foreign Ministry and you have the Prime Minister's office that hasn't had a spokesperson for a long time, only recently, and also has a National Directorate for Public Diplomacy without a head for over a year and a half. You'd think in the middle of a war, that would be important. I think what has to change, Kalev, is first of all the understanding here in Israel that this is a real war, and that the answer to that real war can't be a nice to have, it's a need to have. That kind of Israeli mentality that it doesn't matter what they say about us, it's what we do on the ground, that has to change, because we're living in a different world. We are in a hybrid war. The war is hybrid. It's both military and it's also narrative and it's also communication. And Israel is not even in the arena of the communications war.
Right. I will note one thing. We should note the announcement of the retirement of Colonel Avichai Adrai from the IDF, someone who's been in this position for 20 years, who speaks Arabic, who's been I can think of actually no other figure in the Israeli government or military that had maintained the position of that kind of experience coherence, that continuity, and was able to be as effective as he has been. So there is an example of what can be done when the right person is out there in the right place.
But that's the Army spokesperson unit.
Right.
The Army spokesperson unit have actually done a decent job. But if you're not in coordination with the Prime Minister's office, because you don't have a head of a public diplomacy directorate, and you're not all in the same message, and there's no central command, you can have fantastic people speaking in different forums, but if there's no real strategy or communications fighting this war, it's like all of us being soldiers shooting in a different direction. So whilst people like that have been amazing, and I will say something else, you know, Israel's image, if we are to be accused of being this aggressive military force, do we really need a man in a uniform being the spokesperson for the country? Just these things have to be thought about, how things look and how things and how the messaging is put out and by who and in what structure. We have none of it. We are all soldiers in a war without a military command, without a command structure. And that is something that the government has to wake up and change, because the real Third World War has already started, and it is in the media.
Well, certainly it is, and certainly the impact that the media has had on governments and public opinions. You could see no greater illustration than, for example, Israel's war against Hamas.
Absolutely. And the fact that Hamas has the sympathy of the world somehow, and not Israel, who was attacked, that is as much as an indication of the hatred of Israel, but it's also as much as an indication of the lack of strategy in Israel.
All right, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, thank you for joining us on Security Brief.